They laughed when Big Shaq took an economy seat, but when the truth came out, the entire plane fell silent. A flight full of whispers, judgments, and quiet mockery takes an unexpected turn when a desperate pregnant woman calls out a name no one expected: Big Shaq. Why would she know him? What secret was hiding in plain sight? As tension builds and assumptions shatter, the passengers are forced to confront a truth that none of them saw coming. Some moments change people forever. This was one of them. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The bustling airport terminal hummed with energy as travelers rushed from one gate to another. The overhead announcements blended into a murmur of distant voices, the occasional rolling suitcase clicking against the tiles. In the middle of it all, a tall, broad-shouldered man strode toward Gate 23B, his presence commanding yet oddly understated. Big Shaq wasn't just another passenger. He was famous. A name that carried weight in certain circles, a man who had built a life that the world admired. But today, he wasn't dressed for recognition. Clad in a simple hoodie, dark jeans, and sneakers, he moved with purpose, ignoring the occasional side glance from those who recognized him but hesitated to approach. He adjusted the strap of his carry-on bag, his face unreadable as he reached the boarding gate. The first-class lane was nearly empty, a luxury afforded to those who lived at the top. He could have easily walked in, taken his plush leather seat, and drowned out the world behind noise-canceling headphones. Instead, he paused. Near the counter, a woman stood with one hand resting on her belly, her body slightly leaning against the desk. She wasn't old, late 20s maybe, but the exhaustion in her posture made her look far beyond her years. The airline agent in front of her shook his head apologetically, tapping the screen in front of him. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the agent said, his voice firm but indifferent. "Your request was denied. We're at full capacity in first class." "But," she hesitated, swallowing back frustration. "I was told there was availability when I booked." "There was a system error," the agent replied, already moving on to another task. "I can put in a note for customer service, but there's nothing I can do right now." Big Shaq watched the woman's fingers tighten over her purse strap. He saw the way she glanced over her shoulder at the crowded economy boarding line, her eyes flickering with something between resignation and discomfort. She was struggling. He didn't need to ask why. He took a step forward. "Excuse me," Shaq said, his voice calm but assertive. The agent looked up, doing a double take as recognition dawned in his eyes. "Oh, Mr. Shaq, sir. You're boarding first class?" He nodded, glancing at the woman. "Give her my seat." The agent blinked. Sorry?" "My seat," Shaq repeated, pulling out his boarding pass and sliding it across the counter. "Switch it with hers." The woman's lips parted in shock. "Wait, no. You don't have to do that." "I know," he said simply. The agent hesitated, but ultimately made the switch, printing a new ticket for both passengers. As the woman stared at the golden lettering on her new boarding pass, Shaq gave her a nod, then turned without another word and stepped into the economy boarding lane. The moment Big Shaq entered the narrow aisles of economy, the shift in atmosphere was almost immediate. Passengers looked up from their phones and magazines, their eyes widening in surprise. Murmurs rippled through the rows like a wave of quiet speculation. "What the hell is he doing here?" someone whispered. "I thought guys like him only fly private," another voice murmured. He ignored them, his expression unreadable as he made his way down the cramped aisle, his broad frame barely fitting between the seats. His assigned seat was row 28, right in the middle of the cabin. Not a window, not an aisle. A middle seat. The worst possible spot. As he reached his row, the two passengers already seated next to him. One a middle-aged businessman in a tailored suit, the other a young socialite wearing oversized sunglasses, exchanged glances of thinly veiled amusement. The businessman let out a quiet chuckle. "Didn't expect to see you back here," he said, shifting slightly so Shaq could sit. "Lost a bet?" The socialite smirked, flipping through her phone. "Guess first class was overbooked. Looks like you're stuck with us regular folks." Shaq said nothing. He simply slid into his seat, adjusting his hoodie and staring straight ahead. The businessman didn't take the hint. I gotta ask, he continued, leaning in slightly. A guy like you, big name, big money. What are you doing in the back of the plane? Got some financial trouble? Shaq's fingers curled slightly against the armrest, but he remained silent. The socialite giggled under her breath. Maybe he's hiding from someone, she said, nudging the businessman playfully. Or maybe, she dragged out the words with fake suspense, he's just like us after all. The businessman laughed at that. Yeah, sure, just like us. Across the aisle, another passenger, a man in his early 40s wearing a faded leather jacket, had been watching the exchange. Unlike the others, he didn't seem amused. If anything, his brow furrowed in curiosity. He had seen people jump to conclusions before, but there was something about Shaq's calm, unwavering demeanor that didn't sit right with the mockery. Still, the whispers didn't stop. A group of young men sitting a few rows ahead snuck glances over their shoulders, one of them even lifting his phone to take a covert photo. Shaq felt the flash. He exhaled slowly, tilting his head slightly toward the window. Guess fame doesn't mean much anymore, the businessman muttered, shaking his head as he pulled out his tablet. Not when you're sitting in a middle seat. The flight attendants began their final checks, the overhead bins clicking shut. The engines rumbled, the cabin lights dimming slightly. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the socialite turned slightly toward the businessman. How much you want to bet he asked for a seat change before we land? The businessman chuckled. Wouldn't be surprised. Big Shaq heard every word. He just didn't react. Not yet. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when the whispers started to turn into something sharper. Big Shaq sat still in his cramped middle seat, staring at the seat back in front of him as the soft glow of cabin lights settled over the passengers. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the lingering curiosity morphing into something else. Amusement, judgment, mockery. The businessman to his left, gray suit, expensive cologne, the kind of man who lived off numbers and arrogance, shifted in his seat, making a show of getting comfortable. Still can't believe it, he muttered, his voice loud enough for the row behind them to hear. The socialite on his right, long nails tapping against her designer purse, oversized sunglasses still perched on her nose despite the dim cabin, let out a soft laugh. What? She asked, feigning innocence. That I'm sharing an armrest with Big Shaq in economy, the businessman said with a smirk. Must be a bad investment year, huh? Shaq didn't move. He didn't flinch, but he listened. I mean, it's gotta be something, the businessman continued, shaking his head like it was some great mystery he needed to solve. No way a guy like him sits back here by choice. The socialite leaned in, tilting her head just enough to peek at Shaq's expression. Maybe he lost his first-class seat in a divorce settlement, she whispered conspiratorially. Ex-wife take everything? Another chuckle, this time from the row behind them, where an arrogant influencer in his late 20s, slicked back hair, phone always in hand, voice dipped in fake charm, was already texting something on his screen. Nah, he mused. If he was broke, he wouldn't be flying commercial at all. I think it's something else. The businessman raised an eyebrow. Oh? Like what? The influencer smirked. A scandal. Shaq exhaled slowly, his broad shoulders rising and falling as he resisted the urge to react. Think about it, the influencer went on, his voice picking up enough for nearby passengers to lean in. A guy like him, rich, famous, powerful, why hide in economy? Must be laying low. Maybe some shady deal went wrong. Or maybe he pissed off the wrong people. The businessman chuckled. Could be, maybe he's dodging a lawsuit. Or, the socialite added with a sly grin, maybe he got caught with someone he shouldn't have. Laughter rippled through the small cluster of passengers who had been eavesdropping. Shaq remained silent, but his grip on the armrest tightened for half a second. He had been in the public eye long enough to know how fast narratives could spiral, how quickly people wove stories out of assumptions. He had seen it before, lived it before. But still, the blatant audacity of it all, people openly discussing his life like he wasn't right there, was something he never quite got used to. The flight attendant approached, breaking through the low hum of laughter. She was young, early 30s maybe, with a practiced smile and a stiff posture. The name tag pinned to her uniform read, Rebecca. Shaq could tell the moment she recognized him. the slight flicker in her eyes, the subtle way her shoulders stiffened before she regained composure. But something was different. Instead of the usual warmth or curiosity, there was something colder beneath her professional demeanor. "Would you like a drink, sir?" she asked, her voice clipped and formal. Shaq glanced at the beverage cart, noting the small bottles of top-shelf liquor reserved for first class still sitting untouched. Normally, he would have been offered one without hesitation, but he wasn't in first class. "No, I'm good," he said simply. Rebecca gave a curt nod, then turned to the businessman. "And for you, sir?" The businessman didn't even look at the menu. "Scotch. The best you've got." Rebecca reached for one of the premium bottles. Shaq raised an eyebrow. So, it wasn't that the first-class selection wasn't available to economy passengers. It was just not available to him. Interesting. The businessman took his drink with a smirk, lifting it slightly in Shaq's direction. "No drink for you?" Shaq met his gaze evenly. "Not thirsty." The businessman chuckled. "Right. Bet you're real used to free drinks, huh?" A few passengers chuckled under their breath. Rebecca moved down the aisle, but not before Shaq caught the quick glance she exchanged with another flight attendant near the front. A glance that spoke volumes. It was small, subtle. But Shaq noticed. The influencer was still on his phone, fingers flying across the screen. He grinned, turning the device toward the businessman and the socialite. "Check this out," he whispered. The businessman leaned in, reading the screen. His eyes widened. "No way," he murmured, fighting a laugh. The socialite covered her mouth, trying and failing to suppress a giddy giggle. Shaq already knew. He had seen it too many times before. Someone had taken a photo of him in economy. Someone had posted it online. And now, the internet was about to do what it did best. 15 minutes later, the first ping came from the businessman's phone. Then another, and another. The influencer grinned, scrolling through comments. "Damn," he said, shaking his head. "People are eating this up." The socialite leaned over. "What are they saying?" The influencer smirked, reading aloud. "Big Shaq? More like big budget cut." Laughter. "Here's another," the influencer continued, voice dripping with amusement. "Guess private jets weren't in the budget this year." More chuckles. The businessman shook his head, amused. "Internet's ruthless, man." The socialite grinned. "It's kind of funny, though." Shaq said nothing. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, making the cabin shudder. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered back on, and for a brief moment, the laughter died down as passengers braced themselves. Shaq barely noticed. He was too focused on the patterns unfolding around him. The whispers, the glances, the smirks exchanged between passengers who thought they were in on a joke he wasn't supposed to understand. It wasn't just about him sitting in economy anymore. It was about what people wanted to believe. They wanted him to be broke. They wanted him to be failing. They wanted him to be something less than what he was, because that made them feel bigger in comparison. He had seen it too many times before. And yet, Shaq's gaze flickered toward the front of the cabin, where a pregnant woman sat in first class, a peaceful expression on her face. She had no idea what was happening back here. She had no idea that, at this very moment, the man who had given up his seat for her was being ridiculed for his kindness. And somehow, that made it even more ironic. Shaq exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back against the seat. He had no regrets, but that didn't mean he wasn't watching. And it didn't mean he wouldn't remember, because this flight wasn't over yet. And neither was he. The airport was alive with movement, announcements echoing overhead, suitcase wheels rolling, and hurried footsteps blending into a rhythmic hum. Travelers rushed past, some dragging overstuffed luggage, others tapping furiously on their phones. Amid the chaos, Big Shaq spotted her. She stood near the check-in counter, shoulders tense, one hand pressed gently against her swollen belly. Her other hand gripped her phone, her knuckles white as she whispered urgently. "I don't have another option," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "You don't understand. I need to be in first class. The doctors said long flights could be dangerous." Shaq wasn't one to eavesdrop, but something about her tone made him pause. This wasn't frustration over a lost upgrade. This was fear. The airline agent, a young man with an apologetic but detached expression, was already shaking his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice robotic from repeating the same lines all day. "Your request has been denied. First class is at full capacity." She inhaled sharply. "But the system is locked," the agent cut her off, already moving on to another task. "There's nothing I can do." Shaq watched as her shoulders slumped, her eyes darting toward the crowded economy line. Her breathing grew uneven, her fingers trembling slightly against her belly. She was on the verge of a panic attack, and no one noticed. No one cared. Shaq exhaled slowly. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his deep voice calm but firm. The agent barely looked up until he did a double take. His eyes widened slightly, recognizing Shaq instantly. "Oh, Mr. Shaq," the agent stammered. Shaq pulled out his first-class boarding pass and slid it across the counter. "Give her my seat." The woman's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with shock. "No, you don't have to do that." "I know," he replied simply. She stared at him, searching his face for an explanation. When she found none, her breath hitched, and she quickly looked away, blinking back tears. The agent hesitated before printing out a new ticket. He handed it to her, still watching Shaq as if expecting him to change his mind. Shaq didn't. Instead, he gave the woman a small nod and walked straight into the economy boarding lane. The moment Big Shaq entered economy, the energy shifted. Passengers looked up, their reactions varying. Some exchanged amused glances, others whispered. A few lifted their phones, pretending to scroll but covertly taking pictures. He ignored them. Finding his seat, 28B, a cramped middle seat, he exhaled slowly. He already knew what they were thinking. He had seen those looks before. They assumed he was broke, that he had been demoted, that he was hiding from something. None of them knew the truth, and he had no intention of explaining it. The businessman in the aisle seat smirked as he scrolled through his phone. "Didn't expect to see someone like you back here," he mused, his tone thick with amusement. Shaq didn't react. The businessman nudged the socialite beside him, a woman with oversized sunglasses and a designer scarf wrapped around her neck. "Maybe he lost a bet," she whispered, giggling. "Or maybe he's finally run out of money." Shaq glanced out the window, letting their words roll off him like rain on a windshield. He had nothing to prove to them. A flight attendant passed by, doing a double take when she saw Shaq. Her expression flickered, first with surprise, then something colder. Shaq didn't miss it. She hesitated for just a moment before continuing down the aisle. He had been in the public eye long enough to recognize judgment when he saw it. Meanwhile, in first class, the pregnant woman, Lauren, finally allowed herself to breathe. She sank into the plush leather seat, her body molding into the comfort. The noise of the crowded terminal faded, replaced by a soothing silence. Her fingers curled around the boarding pass, gripping it like a lifeline. She still didn't understand why he had done it. No words had passed between them beyond the simple exchange at the counter. And yet, in that one moment, he had changed everything. She pressed a hand against her belly. The baby kicked gently, as if sensing her relief. Her eyes flickered to the front of the cabin, where flight attendants moved gracefully, preparing for takeoff. For the first time in hours, she felt safe, and she had a stranger to thank for that. Back in economy, the whispers around Shaq hadn't stopped. "Did you see him give up his seat?" one passenger whispered from 2 rows ahead. "Yeah, but why?" another replied. "No way he did that just to be nice." Shaq shifted slightly, his broad shoulders pressing against the confines of the narrow seat. He didn't mind economy. It wasn't about comfort for him. He had spent years learning that some things mattered more than luxury. The businessman sighed dramatically, shaking his head. "Man, what a downgrade," he muttered. "I'd lose my mind if I had to sit back here after flying first class all the time." Shaq finally turned his head slightly, raising an eyebrow. "Would you?" The businessman faltered, caught off guard. Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't?" Shaq didn't reply. Instead, he leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. The businessman shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the influencer across the aisle, who had been sneakily taking photos and typing furiously on his phone. Shaq could already imagine the captions. Fallen from grace. Guess money doesn't last forever. He had seen it all before, and he didn't care. What mattered wasn't what they thought about him. What mattered was that a woman who had been on the verge of breaking down was now sitting safely in a seat where she could breathe. And that was enough. As the plane began its ascent, Shaq kept his gaze on the clouds beyond the window. He had come onto this flight expecting nothing more than a routine journey. Instead, he had witnessed humanity in its rawest form, both its cruelty and its kindness. He had seen judgment, assumptions, whispers of mockery. And yet, at the same time, he had seen a woman saved by a simple act of selflessness. And that, to him, was worth more than any first-class seat in the world. The hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin, blending with the occasional clink of glasses and murmured conversations. Passengers had settled into their seats, but the tension still hung in the air like an unspoken secret. Shaq sat motionless in 28B, his large frame making the cramped seat feel even smaller. He had barely spoken a word since the flight began, yet he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something more toxic. Assumptions, judgment, and ridicule brewing beneath the surface. Then, as if the universe wanted to stoke the fire, the plane lurched violently. A sudden jolt, a sharp dip, a few gasps rang out as overhead compartments rattled. The seatbelt sign blinked back to life. A flight attendant's voice crackled through the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We're experiencing some turbulence." Shaq remained still, gripping the armrest lightly as the plane shuddered again. Across the aisle, the businessman in the expensive suit shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath. The influencer, sitting 2 rows ahead, twisted in his seat with a grin. "Turbulence, huh? Guess even the sky doesn't like sitting with has-beens." The businessman chuckled. "Maybe that's why he's back here. The universe just demoted him along with his seat." The laughter from a few surrounding passengers was low, but loud enough for Shaq to hear. The influencer, sensing an audience, leaned in dramatically. "You know, I heard his career tanked after some bad investments. Couldn't afford the lifestyle anymore." The businessman smirked. No, I read somewhere that he got caught in some scandal. Probably why he's keeping a low profile. Economy class is the best place to hide when you're trying to disappear." A few heads turned. The whispers grew. Shaq still didn't respond. He had been in the public eye long enough to know how quickly people turned stories into truth. The flight attendant, a woman with sharp eyes and a forced smile, walked past but hesitated when she saw Shaq. Recognition flickered across her face before she masked it with polite disinterest. She backtracked and stood beside his seat. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right seat?" The businessman snickered. Shaq looked up slowly. "Yeah." The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because it's unusual for—" She hesitated, then forced a neutral tone. "For someone like you to be here." The words hung in the air. The businessman folded his arms, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Shaq arched a brow. "Someone like me?" The flight attendant's expression flickered with irritation. "I mean, we have rules against passengers sneaking into different sections." A few passengers perked up at that. The influencer smirked. "Yeah," the businessman chimed in, his voice dripping with amusement. "Are we sure he didn't just grab someone else's seat? Maybe he saw an empty one and figured he'd blend in." The laughter spread. The flight attendant didn't laugh. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, eyes scanning him. "Sir, I need to see your boarding pass." Shaq didn't blink. He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out the stub, holding it out without a word. The flight attendant snatched it, eyes flicking over the details. Her expression faltered. The businessman leaned in, clearly expecting to see proof that Shaq didn't belong. But when the attendant handed the ticket back without another word, his smirk faded. Still, she couldn't help adding, "Strange choice, Mr. Shaq Dot." And with that, she walked away. The turbulence had settled, but the tension hadn't. The businessman, now clearly annoyed that his theory was wrong, exhaled sharply. "So, what's the story then? Charity stunt? Trying to look relatable?" The influencer grinned. Nah, he probably lost a bet. That's gotta be it, right? Shaq exhaled slowly, tilting his head back slightly. He knew that no answer would be good enough for these people. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a scandal. But before they could continue their public dissection of his life, another voice cut in. I don't buy it. The group turned to look at the man in 27C, a quiet, middle-aged passenger with sharp eyes and a reserved demeanor. He had barely spoken the entire flight, but now he was watching Shaq with something different from the others. Curiosity, not mockery. The businessman smirked. Oh? What's your theory? The man didn't look away from Shaq. I think everyone's got it wrong. The influencer laughed. Oh, please. What, you think he just likes suffering? The man tapped his fingers against his tray table, thinking. I think he chose to be here. A beat of silence. Then, laughter erupted. The businessman wiped imaginary tears from his eyes. That's rich. Why the hell would anyone choose this? Shaq didn't react. But the man in 27C saw something in his demeanor, in his silence, in the way he never once defended himself, and his own expression shifted slightly. Understanding. The businessman scoffed, shaking his head. Come on, if there was some deep, noble reason, we'd have heard about it by now. Hell, a guy like him would make sure we did. But the man in 27C just smirked slightly, as if he knew something they didn't. He turned back to Shaq. You don't say much, do you? Shaq finally looked at him, meeting his gaze for the first time. A long pause stretched between them. Then, with the faintest hint of amusement in his voice, Shaq finally spoke. No need. And with that, he turned back to the window, leaving the rest of the cabin to wonder, to speculate, and to sit in the discomfort of their own assumptions. The plane hummed softly, the turbulence from earlier now a distant memory. The lights had dimmed slightly, passengers settling into the long stretch of the flight. Some dozed off, others watched movies, and a few still whispered about Big Shaq in economy class. But then, a sharp gasp. It came from first class. A few heads turned, but most ignored it, assuming someone was just shifting in their seat. But then it happened again. A strangled, panicked sound, followed by a flight attendant's hurried footsteps. Shaq, still staring at the window, felt the shift in energy before he even heard the words. Ma'am, are you okay? The murmurs grew. A few passengers sat up straighter, eyes flickering toward the front of the plane. Then, suddenly, a frantic voice cut through the cabin. Something's wrong. She's in pain. In first class, Lauren, the pregnant woman Shaq had silently given his seat to, was clutching her belly, her breathing erratic, beads of sweat forming at her temple. A flight attendant knelt beside her, speaking into her radio. We have a medical emergency. Passenger experiencing severe distress, possible labor complication. Lauren's hand trembled as she grabbed the attendant's wrist. I can't breathe, she gasped. A few first-class passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking concerned, others visibly annoyed that their peaceful flight was being interrupted. One of them, a sharp-dressed older man, sighed, shaking his head. They really need to screen passengers better, he muttered. Flying at that stage of pregnancy? What was she thinking? But then, Lauren's voice rose in desperation, and it was one name that made the entire cabin freeze. Shaq! Big Shaq! The whispers stopped. Every head turned. Every eye snapped to the back of the plane, to row 28B, where Big Shaq sat completely still. The businessman beside him raised a brow. The influencer slowly turned in his seat, mouth slightly open. Even the flight attendant who had mocked Shaq earlier now looked confused. Shaq exhaled slowly. Then, with measured calm, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. And suddenly, every passenger on that plane realized they had been wrong about everything. Shaq made his way toward the front, each step heavy with the weight of 1,000 assumptions crumbling in real time. Passengers leaned into the aisles, whispering furiously. Why is she calling for him? Do they know each other? What the hell is going on? The influencer pulled out his phone, nudging the businessman. Dude, this is insane. Shaq reached first class, his gaze locking onto Lauren's pained expression. She looked up at him, eyes glassy with panic, and in that moment, it didn't matter that the entire plane was watching. "Breathe," Shaq said, his voice calm, steady. Lauren gripped his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. It hurts," she choked out. A flight attendant stepped in. "Sir, do you know her?" Shaq didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The way Lauren clung to him, the way her body instinctively turned toward his presence, it answered the question for him. Passengers were in chaos. The businessman leaned forward, his mind racing. "Wait, what is this? Are they family?" The influencer was already typing on his phone. "Big Shaq linked to mysterious pregnant woman, wild." The businessman scoffed. "This doesn't make sense. Why would he give up first class for her?" But the man in 27C, the only one who had doubted the mob mentality before, just smirked knowingly. "Because he's not the guy you all thought he was." The businessman frowned, but said nothing. For the first time, he had no comeback. Meanwhile, Lauren's breathing grew more erratic. Shaq lowered himself to her level, eyes locked on hers. "Lauren," he said, his voice a quiet anchor in the storm. "Tell me exactly what you're feeling." She whimpered, pressing a hand to her belly. "It's tight. Too tight. My chest, it's..." Shaq turned to the flight attendant. "She's not just in pain. She's panicking. She needs to slow her breathing." The attendant nodded quickly, suddenly realizing that Shaq knew what he was talking about. "Okay," she said, regaining composure. "What do we do?" Shaq shifted slightly, positioning himself so Lauren could focus only on him. "Lauren," he said gently, "listen to my breathing. Match it." He inhaled deeply, slow, controlled. Lauren tried, but her breath stuttered. Shaq nodded once. Again. He took another deep, steady inhale. This time Lauren followed. The tension in her body eased just slightly. The flight attendants watched in stunned silence. Big Shaq wasn't just helping her. He was saving her. In economy, the businessman sat back, rubbing his jaw. "Guess we all look like idiots now, huh?" The influencer put his phone down, sighing. "Yeah, man, we do." Even the flight attendant who had mocked Shaq earlier now stood at the curtain separating first class, her face pale with guilt. Because now, they all knew the truth. Shaq wasn't in economy because he was broke. He wasn't there because he had fallen from grace. He was there because he had chosen to be. For her. Lauren's breathing steadied, and the tension in the cabin finally broke. A doctor on board stepped in, checking her vitals. "She's stable," he confirmed. "She just needed to regulate her oxygen intake. She should be okay for the rest of the flight. But we'll notify emergency services to meet us when we land." Shaq exhaled deeply, his shoulders loosening for the first time. Lauren looked at him, gratitude shining through the exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered. Shaq simply nodded once. As he stood up, preparing to return to his seat, he turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the passengers who had spent the entire flight mocking him. No words were exchanged. He didn't need to say anything, because in their silence, their lowered gazes, their shifting discomfort, he knew. They understood. The cabin, which had once been buzzing with laughter and whispers, was now gripped by an uncomfortable silence. Every passenger who had mocked Big Shaq assumed the worst, and whispered behind his back was now staring straight ahead, their faces pale with embarrassment. Lauren lay in her first-class seat, still recovering, her breath slower, but her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted herself. The doctor on board had reassured the crew that she would be fine, but the real turbulence in the plane wasn't coming from the sky anymore. It was in the guilt weighing down on every person who had laughed at Shaq just hours ago. The businessman, who had spent most of the flight leading the charge of mockery, now avoided looking at anyone. The influencer, who had taken videos, posted tweets, and hyped up the drama, suddenly had no words. And the flight attendant, who had treated Shaq like an imposter, now stood stiffly near the curtain separating first class from economy, her hands clenched. Lauren's voice, though weak, was crystal clear. "Do you all know why he's sitting back there?" A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some tried to avoid her gaze. Others, like the businessman and the influencer, stared at her, frozen in place. Lauren didn't rush. She let the question hang in the air, let them all sit in their own discomfort, before continuing. "I was supposed to be in first class," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "I booked a seat because of my pregnancy. Because my doctor told me I needed the space, that I needed to be comfortable, that it was too risky for me to fly in economy." The businessman exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Lauren's eyes swept across the passengers. "But when I got here, there was a mistake. They told me there were no more first-class seats available, that I could either take an economy seat or miss my flight altogether." A few heads turned toward Shaq now, realization slowly settling in. Lauren's fingers curled around the armrest, her voice thick with emotion. "I was panicking. I didn't know what to do. I thought I'd have to miss my flight, and I was scared. Really scared." She turned her head, locking eyes with Shaq. And then he showed up. The cabin held its breath. Every eye shifted to Big Shaq, who had barely spoken since this entire flight began. Lauren's lips parted slightly, her voice a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate, She swallowed, shaking her head slightly. "He just gave me his ticket, handed it over and walked away before I could even process what happened." Gasps rippled through the plane. The businessman blinked, as if his brain couldn't quite catch up with what he was hearing. The influencer who had tweeted about Shaq sitting in economy as if it were a scandal, now felt his stomach drop. And the flight attendant, the one who had accused Shaq of sneaking into economy, now looked like she wanted to disappear. Lauren let the weight of her words sink in. "You all assumed the worst about him," she said quietly. "And you were wrong." Shaq finally moved. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders loosening as he rolled his neck slightly. Then, for the first time, he spoke. "You know what's funny?" His voice was deep, steady, and undeniably powerful. "Every single one of you decided you knew who I was before I even said a word." The businessman flinched slightly. The influencer stared at his phone, but for once didn't lift it to record. Shaq's gaze swept over the plane, locking onto faces that had been laughing at him just hours ago. "You saw me in economy and thought, he must have messed up his life somehow." He let out a small, humorless chuckle. "You made jokes, you whispered. Even the crew." His eyes flickered toward the flight attendant, who had paled considerably. "Decided I wasn't worth their respect anymore." A thick, oppressive silence filled the cabin. Shaq shook his head. And all it took to break that illusion was one truth you didn't see coming. Lauren's eyes shone with emotion. Shaq's voice softened just slightly, but the impact remained. "Maybe next time," he said. "You'll think before you assume." The rest of the flight was eerily quiet. The businessman, who had led the mockery, now sat with his arms crossed, staring at the seat in front of him, ashamed. The influencer, who had documented every moment for content, had put his phone away. The notifications still poured in, but he ignored them. Even the flight attendant, who had treated Shaq like a fraud, couldn't meet his eyes as she passed by. As the plane descended, as the runway lights came into view, one thing was clear. No one would ever forget this flight. Because Big Shaq didn't just sit in economy. He exposed the ugliness of judgment, the cruelty of assumptions, and the quiet power of true kindness. And he did it without ever needing to prove himself. 7. The lesson learned. The cabin was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence that comes after a long flight, but the heavy, loaded kind. The kind that lingers when people are forced to confront the ugly truth about themselves. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft ding, and the captain's voice crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Local time is 8:43 a.m. We appreciate you flying with us today and hope you have a wonderful stay." A few passengers shifted in their seats. Some stretched, grabbing their bags, but the usual post-flight chatter wasn't there. Instead, there was hesitation, guilt. And all of it was directed at one man sitting in economy class, Big Shaq. Shaq sat in 28B, his posture relaxed, his face unreadable. Even after everything that had happened, after the mockery, the judgment, the realization, the shame, He still hadn't spoken more than a few sentences. And yet somehow, he had said everything. The businessman, who had spent most of the flight cracking jokes at Shaq's expense, now sat stiffly in his seat. He wasn't scrolling through his phone anymore. His fingers hovered over the screen, where his half-written tweet mocking Shaq still sat, waiting to be posted. He stared at it. Then, without a word, he deleted it. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had spent the entire flight so sure that he knew exactly what kind of man Shaq was. And now? Now he wasn't sure he even knew what kind of man he himself was. The influencer, who had treated the situation like a reality show, hesitated before unlocking his phone. His fingers twitched toward his camera roll, where photos and videos of Shaq sitting in economy, looking out of place, waited to be uploaded. He had been so eager to go viral, so excited to cash in on someone else's perceived downfall. But now, all he could think about was how wrong he had been. He backed out of his camera roll and opened a new post instead. Today, I learned something important. Kindness doesn't need an audience. And real character isn't loud. It's quiet, steady, and doesn't ask for recognition. I almost got it wrong, but I won't make that mistake again. He hit post. The flight attendant, the one who had questioned Shaq's seat, treated him like an imposter and assumed the worst, stood near the front of the cabin, watching him. She had been in the service industry for years. She had seen celebrities before. She had catered to the rich, the entitled, the arrogant. And she had assumed Shaq was just another one of them. But now, as she stood there, clutching the passenger manifest in her hands, she felt something foreign creep into her chest. Regret. She wanted to say something. Maybe an apology. Maybe just a small acknowledgement that she had been unfair, that she had been wrong. But when Shaq finally stood up, stretching his legs, adjusting his hoodie, and grabbing his carry-on, he didn't even glance in her direction. Not in anger, not in resentment, just indifference. And somehow, that hurt more than any words could. The passengers slowly began filing out of the plane. Most of them walked past Shaq quietly, avoiding his gaze, their earlier arrogance completely gone. Some wanted to say something, to acknowledge him, to apologize, but none of them did. Because deep down, they knew they didn't deserve his forgiveness. The businessman paused for a brief second near Shaq's row. His mouth opened slightly, as if he was about to say something. But in the end, he just nodded once. Shaq nodded back. And that was enough. As Shaq stepped into the jet bridge, the cold airport air hitting his face, the influencer took one last hesitant step forward. "Hey man," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I just wanted to say that I..." Shaq turned slightly, raising a brow. The influencer swallowed his words. Because he realized something at that moment. Shaq didn't need to hear an apology. He already knew. Instead, the influencer just sighed, giving a small, sheepish smile. "You're a good dude." Shaq chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Took you long enough." And with that, he walked away. The airport was alive with movement, people rushing to their gates, others embracing loved ones, some dragging suitcases half their size. Shaq blended into the crowd effortlessly. He wasn't Big Shaq, the celebrity here. He was just a man walking through an airport, minding his own business. And that was exactly the way he wanted it. The businessman sat in the waiting area near baggage claim, staring at nothing in particular. The influencer leaned against a column, scrolling through his phone. And the flight attendant stood near the exit, her arms crossed, lost in thought. Each of them, in their own way, was replaying the flight over and over in their minds. The things they had said, the things they had assumed, and the lesson they had learned. Because for the first time in a long time, they had been forced to confront something uncomfortable. That maybe, just maybe, they weren't as good of people as they thought they were. As Shaq disappeared into the sea of travelers, his presence on that flight became something more than just a memory. It became a quiet lesson. A lesson about assumptions. A lesson about judgment. A lesson about who people really are when no one's watching. And most importantly, a lesson about the kind of person Big Shaq was, even when no one was looking. Did this story make you rethink how we judge others? Don't just scroll. Hit follow for more powerful, thought-provoking stories that challenge perspectives and reveal hidden truths. What would you have done if you were on that flight? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it.